Welcome to another episode of Poetry to Your Ears podcast. Today we're joined by Ella.
Hello.
Do you just go by Ella?
Ella Sadie.
Ella Sadie.
Ella Sadie or Ella Sadie Guthrie.
That's your poetry name?
It's my full name.
Your full name.
Well, actually, it's not my full name. I have another middle name, but I never use it.
Yeah. And you have like is that what the name you use for like your poetry accounts and your books?
That's my byline, I guess.
Yeah.
So I publish under Ella Sadie Guthrie, and my Instagram and Twitter is at Ella Sadie OG.
There you go.
Well, there you have it.
So you know, now you haven't even heard anything from me yet, but you know where to find me.
Yeah, we start with that. So how did you find out about Ella in the first place, Lulu?
From Words by the Water.
Yes,
we talk about every episode, I think.
We're famous.
Yeah. Tell us more about Words by the Water, maybe.
So, Words by the Water is actually quite fun. So I run it with Ollie O'Neill, who is an incredible poet and a good friend of mine. And I first met Ollie at a night called Verses in London, which is run by Nash, Jack and Nats. Big up the boys because they do an amazing job. And I was visiting with a friend of mine, just open micing, and Ollie was featuring, and I saw her perform her first pamphlet, Ways of Coping, and I was like, who is this girl? I love this so much.
She is so good, isn't she?
She's amazing. And she actually gave me her book for free because I didn't have cash, and then she was like, just take it. And I was like, oh my God. And then I followed her on Instagram, and I think a little bit later she followed me on Instagram. And then, you know, when you're kind of Instagram friends with someone, but you don't really know each other. Mm. And then about a year ago, I think she moved down to Brighton. And didn't know anyone really in Brighton. So I messaged her like, hey, do you want to hang out? So we went for a coffee, and she was like, oh, where are the good poetry nights in Brighton? And I was like, there's not that many, actually. Like, there's only a couple. And I was like, do you want to start one?
Which is weird because now I feel like there's so many nights.
Yeah, I feel like we kickstarted a movement a little bit. But I was like, you know, there's not really that many around. Like, there's like the standard ones, but a lot of them happen in pubs and stuff. And I was like, I really want to start a new one and like have it a bit like different and build it into something. And she was like, yeah, let's start one. So we did. And at that time, where we run it is the Selina Hotel in Brighton, and their room, Amy's room, was brand new, and they were doing non-charging nights, so you could hire the space for free for like the whole of June. So we did the night then, and then because so many people buy drinks, they allowed us to keep the room for free, and then they make all the money off the bar. So it's been going pretty well.
Because you were doing like a creative night, something like creative related.
Yeah. So they actually hold loads of other events in that room. It's a co-working space, and then come like 5-6 o'clock they have like workshops and stuff. But yeah, it works really well for the night, as I think you guys can agree.
Yeah, we've been and enjoyed it there. It's great.
Yeah.
But how do you get poets for it?
Features,
yeah.
So Ollie and I have been in the poetry scene for quite a while. A lot of the people who we get to feature are people who we've heard about or we've seen that we really like, and who either feature a lot or deserve a feature slot, or maybe have a book coming out and want to promote it. So I think the last feature that we did was, we missed out February, didn't we? So we did January.
It was a fundraising.
Yeah, the fundraiser. And then before that it was PJ, the repeat beat poet, who is a good friend of mine, who's actually one of the guys who got me into actually being able to write poetry. I was a bit too shy, and he was like, no, you can do it. So I did.
You have some mentors then? Already.
Yeah, of course. Like everyone does, I think, at least. And we're looking at doing a couple of shows in a bigger venue, so hopefully we'll get some bigger names like Joelle Taylor and Cecilia Knapp to come and perform as well. But Aflo was a recommendation from PJ. Connor came to our first night, and he's amazing, and he we knew that we needed him to feature. And yeah, just it's really just like you just see people. If you get involved in the scene, you start to know who's good and who you want, and yeah.
Yeah. And how difficult or challenging was it setting up this this ongoing event? Like, was it a daunting task while you were doing it? Or were you like excited the whole time while you were putting it together?
The first night was daunting. And then the second night was daunting because it was the first time that we charged for tickets, because the first one was completely free. You're always worried that no one's going to turn up. It's going to be an awful night. But now it's not, it's not like it's not challenging still, but it's more like we knew it was going to be good. It's just hoping that people will turn up. And it's also just remembering to do it on top of everything else. So like making sure that you've got the right ticket sales and everything, and everyone who's featuring is gonna come, and you have enough money to pay them and everything like that.
And you work in events as well, right?
Yeah, so I also work in event production and operations, so that part is kind of, you kind of got it down. It's a much smaller event than... So
it was a lot more natural for you to think about starting a poetry night.
Yeah, I think it's easier than people think it is. One thing I would say is, like, if you want to do something, just figure out how to do it. Break it down into smaller pieces and just try and do it, because it will probably work out better than you expect, unless you have too high expectations.
So when did you start writing poetry, performing poetry? It was before putting the event together?
Oh yeah, years before.
And so were you kind of connected already in the poetry scene before you started the night, right? It wasn't a case of like building up completely from nothing.
No, actually, I've wanted to start a night for a while. So I also co-run a collective called WRIOT Collective with a friend of mine called Ruth, and we started that in London. And all throughout the pandemic, we did online poetry workshops, and it was like a female focused collective, so it was like mostly women and non-binary poets who came along to our sessions, and we actually have a zine coming out at some point this year, so that's quite exciting. That's all the poems that we wrote in lockdown. So I'd already like been in that, we'd been running that for like probably like a year and a half, but I lived in London. I'm from Brighton, but I lived in London for like years and moved back during the pandemic, so I was very involved in the poetry scene there for about 3-4 years. So
in London or in Brighton?
In London. So
what about the poetry scene in Brighton?
Not really. Like, I'd never really got into it that much, because every time I came home, it just didn't really seem like there was that much on. Not compared to London. Like London, there's a lot of things going on all the time.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit? The poetry scene in London, what it's like?
Sure. So the spoken word scene in London is pretty big. Yeah. There's a night on almost like there's like at least 3 nights on every week, you know. It's almost like
that crossover between like rap and poetry.
Like you get a lot of that, actually. There's a lot of like guys who are like, I normally do this over a beat, but I'm going to do it a cappella tonight. And you're like, okay. But also the page poetry and like the more established poetry scenes, like mostly centered in London. So you've got the Poetry Library, you've got the South Bank Centre, you've got all these art funds that are like using poets to create like workshops or activities or even advertisements like in London. So there's a lot more generally like kind of going on.
Yeah, I would imagine it's more tiered as well. Like you get more kind of like bourgeois poets, you know, and then you have like that more kind of rap.
Of course, yeah. Like for example, the night I'm going to tomorrow is Outspoken, which started off as like quite a small night, and now they're a publishing house, and Joel Taylor and I've forgotten the other guy's name. He's really famous as well, like famous poet, but I've forgotten his name. Anthony and Anaxaguru. They run Outspoken basically, maybe with some other people, and their night's at the South Bank Centre now, and it's like £10 a ticket, seated, like incredible night.
I personally feel quite scared of the poetry nights in London because it feels so much more huge. So to like do open mics and stuff is like, you gotta be really good.
Honestly, you don't. You really don't. I've seen some terrible. I admire every single poet who gets up and says something. Like, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about the scene. But I've seen some terrible poems, so don't worry about it. Also, the nights.
We said that with love.
We say that with love. Yeah, you'll get better soon. Don't worry. When I first started, I was definitely terrible, so it's fine. But I think in London, there's so many different types of nights. So, for example, the Poetry Society at the Poetry Cafe, they do an open mic night, which is like every Tuesday. And there's no feature, it's just open mics, and they get through everyone. So sometimes there's like 50 people all doing one poem, and it's crazy, it's insane. And it's like anyone from like trying, like good people trying new material or brand new to poetry, and there's just so many different levels of poetry nights, like tiny ones, massive ones, like it's everywhere. But it's a much bigger city. So
it looks like you really started with London then. But when did you start writing poetry?
So that's a good question, because so I've always been a writer, but I started with journalism. I was a journalist first. And then when I was doing my NCTJ, I realised that I hated journalism.
NCTJ being?
Oh, it's a qualification. It's like a working journalism qualification. So it's kind of like an MA, but it's not really. It's like, it's a lot shorter. And it's a lot more like intense, and then you finish it.
Like a master, you don't finish.
Yeah, no. And I was doing that, and I absolutely hated it. And I was like, I really don't want to be a journalist. And that's when I was getting into events more. And at the same time, I went to see Cecilia Knapp, who is actually a Brighton poet. She's born and raised in Brighton, and she writes a lot about Brighton, but she's like a Londoner now, basically. But the way she writes is so rhythmic. She's basically like storytelling to a rhythm. And as soon as I heard her perform, I was like, this is what I want to do. Like, that's what I've been looking for forever. Because when I was younger, I wanted to be like a singer or a musician, and I've always loved music, but I can never, and a performer, but I've never really saw myself as an actress, or I never got into like one instrument enough to be like, I'm a musician. So when I saw like performance poetry, I was like, this is what I want to do. And I went home.
And how old were you then?
Oh, it must have been about 22, 23 at the time. So about 5-6 years ago now, I think. I think that's maths.
Age is a weird thing.
A pandemic age as well. I'm like, I don't know what happened there. And I remember coming home and getting my journal out and just writing my first spoken word poem. And I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do.
So it became quite easy.
Yeah, it became way easier than I thought it would. And that poem I still perform today, actually.
Wow. So did you had confidence in it straight away? Like,
yeah.
You felt like
it felt like something clicked. Like I was like, this is my purpose. This is what I'm meant to be.
Yeah. How do you make a differentiation between like knowing something's good or not when you've just written it?
That's a really good
because
point.
Because I wonder this with Éloïse as well, because she writes stuff straight away, and then you don't really edit it too much after.
Is either good or not good?
I agree and disagree. So when I first started writing, I definitely had that where I was like, I write it and then I don't edit it and it's done. That was about 5-6 years ago. Now, with my work, especially doing more poems for the page, and now that I'm publishing a lot more, you go back and you edit a lot more. But I think there's something intrinsic about writing a poem. I think you know when it's good and when it's not good. And I also think that one of the reasons that made me realize that this is what I wanted to do and that I was good at it and this was my purpose is that when I was a journalist, every time I would write, I would get imposter syndrome so badly. And I'd be like, is this good? Like, who am I trying to impress? Like, I would just have like a meltdown every time I tried to write a big article because I was just like, I just don't know if I can do this. And when I write poems, even if it's a bad poem, I don't like judge myself as a poet. I'm just like, okay, well, this didn't come out the way I wanted it to. I'll put it in the bank and maybe in a couple of years I'll look at it again and maybe one line or two lines might spur an idea for a new poem, or maybe I'll borrow from it, or maybe it'll be better, or maybe I can go back and edit it then and have a look and see. I think time is a really big thing with poems, and I think everything that you think of and create comes back to you in a different way. It doesn't have to be like the be all and end all if you write a poem and you don't like it.
So a lot of your ideas, they gestate, they take time to develop in your head.
Yeah, definitely.
Before you sit down and write it straight out.
What was your first poem about?
My first poem is a poem called Hymn, and it's about my first proper breakup, which was a real serious breakup because we were together for like 4 years. And I still think love poetry is one of the best forms of poems ever. I think all poems are somewhat love poems in a way.
One of the only poems I heard you perform was saying to your friend, you think you don't want to write love poetry.
Yeah. Who said that at one of your nights? They said,
isn't
every poem's a love poem or something like this.
Yeah, I think that. And yeah, it's this poem about, and it's very much a spoken word poem. Like, it doesn't work on the page at all. And I think making that distinction when you start getting more into poems or writing poetry is quite a key thing to create.
Is that because it needs your voice to express it? Almost like singing a song. It needs to be expressed at the exact right
I think
pitch.
there's a rhythm to it. And some poems, they're more like monologues. And you read them to an audience, and the audience is like, yeah, wow, that's great. I'm there with you in the room. And I think you definitely can get that with page poems, but the way you write for the page, you tend to miss out things like the or I, or you shorten things, or you create spaces where the reader can fill in those gaps for themselves. And when you're performing in front of an audience, you need to fill those gaps in for the audience in order for them to follow you, if that makes sense.
So do you think that you do both?
Yeah, definitely. And some poems fit both arenas, but some don't. And I think it's only in the last year or two that I've really started to understand which poems work in which way. Like the first poem I wrote, I would never send to a magazine now. But when I was first sending things to magazines, I would send it along because I was like, oh, I love this poem. This is a great poem, but it doesn't work as well when you read it.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like from the start you did have an aspiration to get your work out there, to maybe make something of it, to use it in some way. There's I feel like, I'm not a poet myself, but I feel like the vast majority of poets are kind of these tortured artists who keep everything hidden and secret and never put it out in front of people.
Yeah, not me. I think perhaps it's because when I found poetry, I was so amazed that I'd found it, because I was always looking for what exactly I need, like what form I needed to express myself in. I always knew that it was writing in some way, but I could never quite figure out where I was supposed to lie. And as soon as I found poetry, I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do.
So you went to open mics then straight away? Yeah.
So a friend of mine, PJ, who is the repeat beat poet who came and featured at our night in December, he runs a night called Penting in London, which is a really good night if you get the chance to go. And it was when they were first starting it up, and I was like, oh, I want to do an open mic. And he was like, come to Penting. And he put me on the open mic list and didn't tell me, and was like, come up, do a poem. And I was
while you were in the audience,
so scared. But I did it, and everyone was so supportive. And I was like, do you know what? The thrill and that rush.
That real buzz, yeah.
I was like, I want to do this all the time. I want to do it. I want to be on stage. I want to like pour my heart out to strangers.
Maybe it was good that you didn't know, so your stress was very short.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I still get that like nerves now when you're like waiting to go on stage and you're like, oh, is the audience going to like it? Are they not?
And you have a book coming out.
I do have a book coming out. Shameless plug. Yeah.
Tell us about it.
So the book is a pamphlet. It's being published with Broken Sleep Books, which is an independent poetry publisher, on the 31st of August. So basically September you'll be able to buy it. And it's called Poems for Pete Davidson because I have a massive crush on Pete Davidson, and I don't care who knows it, apparently.
He's really popular with the ladies.
He is. And do you know what? You either get it, the girls that get it, get it.
Yeah.
The girls that don't. That's all I'm going to say about it. Well, that's not all I'm going to say about it. We're probably going to talk about it a lot more, but
I actually don't know.
You-
Davidson.
He's the guy who's dating Kanye's ex.
yeah, Kim Kardashian,
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Kanye's ex.
he could date so many women, but
But who is he? An actor?
He's a
Yeah.
comedian.
Comedian.
And actor. Yeah. So he's on SNL. He's been on SNL for like 9 years now.
Hmm.
I think he's really funny, and I think
Yeah.
that's also partly why I'm really attracted to him, because his sense of humor is
I
just
knew
exactly
him from
mine.
these kind of roasts, these comedy roasts,
Yeah.
before SNL, where he was just this like small comedian.
So how do you write a whole
Yeah.
collection about your crush on Pete Davidson?
So
The whole collection's about that.
the whole collection is about Pete
Wow.
Davidson, but
How
I
many
have
poems?
to clarify.
That's commitment.
I have to clarify that it's actually about me. Like, it's poems for Pete Davidson. They're about Pete Davidson, haha. But they're actually about me. Like, all poetry is actually like about the writer,
Sure.
I think. And so basically, I've got ADHD as well, and ever since I was a child, I've been like my ability to fantasize and daydream is like second to none. Like, I can create entire worlds in my head and just zone off at the click of a fingers and just create this whole world and just live in it. It's always something I've been able to do. So I've always had this like intense imagination.
Maybe
You-
that's
you-
why you found writing poetry easy then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how like it all just like kind of clicked and came forward to me, and I can use it as a starting point, I guess. But it was also quite hindering because all I want to do is daydream sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. If you were a big daydreamer when you were a child.
Oh, massive daydreamer when I was a child. I
Yeah.
literally lived in my own head like all the time. I like read all the time. I would follow the story on in my head, like create all these little worlds. I've also always had a thing where whenever I'm walking or running, it makes the daydreams more vivid. So I would run up and down my hallway as a
Wow,
child
that's
for
interesting, yeah.
hours, creating these worlds in my head. And now when I look back at it, I'm like, yeah, ADHD. That
Kind
makes
of runs
sense.
a motor.
So I've always been able to do that. And I was creating, what the poetry collection is also about is celebrity culture and this fascination with success, as well as like celebrity and fame. Especially when you're a writer, like sometimes you're like thinking about, okay, well, where do I get to the point where I feel like I've achieved something? And for me, I've always been a big fan of Patti Smith, so I've always imagined myself like living in New York and being like a writer, like Fran Lebowitz and stuff like that. So I was thinking about it, and I was like, in this world that I imagine myself living in, who could I be with? And I was like, oh, Pete Davidson. Like at that time, now he's like blown up because he's dating Kim Kardashian. But at that time, he'd like just broken up with Ariana Grande.
Why does he only date
When was that then?
super famous women, in your opinion?
I think because he just gets like, everyone's like, why are they going for him? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe because he's actually secretly sexy. Like, he must be a really good lover. Like, come on. And he's funny. Everyone loves a funny guy.
Yeah. He's got a really cool look as well, right? Like I feel like so many guys are like copying his look right now because of his like status.
But I also think like he's self-deprecating but self-aware. So I feel like things just kind of rub, like he's just like, yeah, like this is me, whatever. Like he can just do it, you know? But yeah, so like that's basically how the whole thing came about. So I started fantasizing loads about him. And then I wrote one poem, and then it got published in a magazine. So I was like, maybe I should write a whole collection about these like weird things. I was like, they're in my head anyway.
He inspired you to write these love poems.
Yeah, well, I was like, they're in my head anyway. I might as well
when you're
figure
obsessed
out
about something.
Yeah. Well, I might as well use it. You know, if it's there, if it's not doing anything, I might as well write some poems about it, and then at least I feel like I'm achieving something. And then at Ollie's book launch, I read some of them, and it caught the interest of a publisher. So I sent them the collection of poems that I had, and they were like, "Yeah, I want to publish this." So it's kind of crazy.
Cool, yeah. So
when was that then?
So I got the news of the book being accepted in December. So That was
Great.
really
You
exciting.
must have been elated.
I was so happy. I announced it at the Christmas dinner table the same way that people would announce, like couples would announce the birth of their first child. Like, oh, we're pregnant or we're engaged. I was like, guys, I have a book.
I mean, it is the birth of your first child.
Yeah, it is the birth of my first child. I was like, I have a baby. And my mum looked at me like, what? And I was like, it's a book.
Traumatic.
Yeah.
And then everyone was very excited. And my granddad asked me what the book was about. And I said, Pete Davidson. And he looked at me.
And he said, who's that?
Yeah. And I told him. And the look on his face went from elated joy to like confused disappointment. So it's fine. No, they're very happy, but they have no idea what I do, really.
This
Like
theme,
most parents.
this theme keeps coming up when we talk to people about when they were in school, their appreciation of poetry was like not that great. They kind of saw poetry as something that was fuddy-duddy. It was like war poems and
Fuddy-duddy.
and old.
It's just not relatable. Like not
Yeah.
an art form that you can appropriate yourself.
Do you recognize that sentiment?
Oh, 100%.
Is that it's almost like when you found spoken word poetry again? It kind of like it felt like
Yeah.
something new. So
It
like
really,
refreshed it.
it really, really rejuvenated the whole industry for me. And I do think that even though, yes, there are a couple of Carol Ann Duffy poems, a couple of poems written in like, kind of like Jamaican tongue as well. Like my cousin is 16 and I looked at her GCSE poetry textbook. She asked me for some help. And I was like, oh God, I'm not even sure I can help you with these because that's not really my jurisdiction, I guess.
Like literature critics, is it quite?
Yeah, I was like, I don't know how to write an essay on this at GCSE level. Like, I just know how to appreciate it, I suppose, in my own way. But yeah, when I was at school, I didn't dislike poetry, but I didn't really get it. And I was big into reading. I loved books and stories and plays to a certain extent as well. But I just didn't really get poetry. I don't think enough. I don't think they teach it in the right way. And
Did you ever feel like you wanted to be a novelist?
Yeah, I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to be an author when I was a kid. Still do now. Like, still got ideas for books that are yet to be written.
So the poetry thing was kind of like a coming back to something that was a bit more artful, more aesthetic, rather than political. Would you say? Because it seems like your poetry is not very political in that sense.
That's a really good point, because part of the reason when I kind of made that proper switch to poetry, I mean, I still do a tiny bit of music journalism here and there, and I would love to do some documentary stuff, but I've realised that I wanted to be an artist, that I was born to be an artist, and I could, with my art, I could speak about what I wanted to speak about, etc. I'm still a very political person. My degree is in politics, and I think politics affects every single aspect of your life, and I think it's a privilege to say that it doesn't. And when I was younger, I used to write a lot more political stuff, but now I just kind of write what I want to write. But I think even the Pete Davidson collection is political in its own way, because it talks about celebrity culture and fame, which is a part of society which is ruled by politics. So,
did you ever write like very politically engaged poem?
Yes, when I first started writing, I used to work for a charity called My Life, My Say, which gets young people engaged in politics. And I wrote 2 poems in total, one of which is still in circulation as a video, which was we did like a spoken word video where we got young people engaged to vote. And the other one I performed in the House of Commons. So,
oh wow.
Yeah, I did used to write a lot more political stuff, but it's more spoken stuff that's never really been recorded, apart from that video somewhere. But
and what was the poem like that you performed in the House of Commons? It's laden with expletives.
It's called Tea with My Grandad. And
complete opposite.
Complete opposite, yeah. Fork in the road there.
They had to pre-read it before you performed it.
It's so basically, I had the idea. I knew that I was commissioned to write this poem, and I knew I was going to perform it in the House of Commons for this APPG. And was basically like a hearing. It was about young people and Brexit. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write about, because I didn't want to just go in like, here's a political poem. And I was having tea with my granddad, who is a Conservative voter. We were talking about politics, and we were having discussions and disagreements, but we always have quite interesting discussions. He's always very like open-minded, but the likelihood of him changing his vote is very slim. And I just got really inspired by our discussion that day, and I just wrote about how all of the ways that we discuss politics and change our mind. And at the end of the discussion, he was like, you should run for like MP. He's like, you'd be great. You should do it. It inspired me.
Supportive.
And it inspired me to kind of have the message of the poem be like, everyone needs, instead of complaining about it, you can still complain about it, but like make the effort to do something, I guess. Which, I mean, especially in these days, feels quite hard and far away, but the message was there at least. Maybe it was the idealistic youth, but
So you asked Ella to prepare a poem for today?
Yes. So I'll read a poem from the Pete Davidson pamphlet.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
What a treat.
So this is like
So this
brand
is
new,
unreleased.
exclusive.
Yeah.
Unreleased. Like I said, this collection is all about poets, called Poems for Pete Davidson. Pete Davidson takes on the general theme in pretty much all of the poems. They differ between scenarios that I'm thinking about with him. So like I'm creating this like daydream in my mind, and I describe it in this daydream, but it draws in real life and everything like that. Or there's something that's going on with Pete Davidson that I'm reacting to.
In the collection, is it in some kind of chronological order?
Yes.
Or is it? Oh, it is.
It is.
So it kind of tells a story, like an
It
imaginary romance story.
It does.
Wow,
It's all in chronological order.
I think there's a big market for this Pete Davidson love. I do.
Do you know what?
I think it's going to be.
My friend was like, "You've timed this perfectly," and I was like, "I did not mean for him to blow up like this. This has happened completely by accident. It just so happens that every time I'm watching the news, I'm like, Pete, please don't do anything to jeopardize my pamphlet coming out. Like, be the good guy." So this poem is one of the scenarios that I've created in my head. So there's all these different scenarios in the book of how Pete Davidson and I eventually meet. And this is one of them, and it's called Pete Davidson and I Meet in a Hip New Art Gallery near Brooklyn. Pete Davidson and I meet in a hip new art gallery near Brooklyn. And I've never actually been to Brooklyn, so I can't describe the surroundings or the street or tell you which letter train I took to get there, but I can tell you it is raining outside and I am big black boots and dungarees. And everyone in the art gallery is careful to hold each other's expectations in the corner of the room. Desperate. Don't accidentally alter priceless pieces. In this scenario, my hair is long, dark, and dripping wet. I never remember an umbrella, and I left my hat holding onto a rope, the kind that could break at any moment when I look into the mirror and see my real reflection. I am wearing a long grey coat by Ralph Lauren I got for free from a girl who left her flat in Camberwell for Singapore at late notice. In real life, I lost the coat a couple of years ago. But here I am, an island in its waters, reminding myself the good things always come back. Pete Davidson stands alone for once. He is admiring a piece of art projected onto the wall. The piece builds the longer you stare at it. At first, you don't notice the small alterations, the offering of each layer. A mother-in-law slowly adding more sugar to your tea. A whole conversation passes before we look at the art again and see a totally different escape. Wet wood, an hourglass, a dog waiting for its owner to come home. I see none of these things, and yet I feel them in the absence of what came before. I say nothing. It reminds me of the Joan Miró Museum at the top of Montjuic, Barcelona, where I spent the whole day contorting myself into thinly veiled paintings of dicks. I tell him this. He laughs.
Bravo.
Ooh.
That's one of the poems.
And this
Yeah.
didn't happen?
Unfortunately, not yet. Not yet. I'm
It-
manifesting it.
Yeah.
Maybe the whole book is a manifestation of my daydreams.
So you'll meet him in different ways then?
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of doing a show based on it, like a play, kind of
That would
based
be
on the
so
book,
Yeah,
fun.
yeah.
and calling it Pete Davidson, Please Call Me.
It feels like a
Like a one-woman show.
Yeah.
yeah, it feels like a scene in a movie actually as well. You know, like we want more. You know, we want to
Yeah.
find out where this is going.
Well, you have to read the
Yeah.
book to find out.
It's like kind of narrative poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like narrative is a real thing that I love using in poetry. It's how I started writing, and I think it's how it will always have a really big impact
It's
on
very
the way I write.
literary. Like,
Yeah,
inspired by
it's like
books
surreal
and-
narrative is kind of the way I like to call it. Like
Mm.
it's happening, but it's something. It's also like kind of not happening in a weird way.
And
I
you-
like
you-
that you lost your coat.
Yeah, I was going to say you kind of acknowledge the fact that it's kind of a fantasy within the poem, right?
Yeah,
By this mention of this coat.
yeah.
It's
So the whole book actually, the references to it being a fantasy is very like, it's very self-aware, even if it's a bit extreme at times. And it plays with the whole idea that I'm like, I know that this is just a fantasy, and like, what does it mean for me? Like, why am I thinking these things?
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that's interesting. Let me ask you a direct question. Like,
Sure.
Why is it important to flag that up in the poem, as opposed to just telling the fantasy?
Because I think the whole book, like I said, even though I said the book is about Pete Davidson, it's not. It's actually about me. So I think the importance of flagging the idea that it's all made up in my mind is bringing the reader back to the idea that it's actually not about Pete Davidson. It's about the narrator. You know, it's about me. It's about why I think these things and how they come into my brain and what it means for my idea of like self-worth or...
I think you should sell it to everyone who thought daydreaming was wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is
Exactly.
tying it back to that
Or
If you
daydream.
write down
parents.
your daydreams,
Yeah.
you're fine. Like,
Or to teachers who say,
yeah.
focus now.
Yeah, exactly. I might send it to all my teachers who ever told me to stop daydreaming. I'll be like, well, I published a book out of it. So there we go.
It's like the importance of having a kind of fantasy life within your life as well.
Yeah.
There's something special about that.
Sure, but I think it also helps you figure out what you want in a weird way, or like, you know, I think a lot of this book is an exploration of why I'm so obsessed with like success in this way and what success means to me. And the whole book is an exploration of going down that road and being like, well, do I really need this? Like, why do I think that this is the be all and end all? Like, why do I feel like I have to be in New York to like be a writer? Like, I don't, but it's always been that like pipe dream for me. And a lot of the book is about New York as well. So it's like a bit of a love letter to both, I guess.
And in a way, with this book, you first got published. So it's
Yeah,
success. What
exactly.
Does that mean to you?
Honestly, it's a dream. Like, I think, you know how like I was saying when I first started doing poetry and I was like, oh, I feel like I'm where I'm meant to be and this is my purpose. As soon as I started being like, okay, well, instead of like going against the grain and fighting myself for these daydreams and beating myself up for it, if I just start writing them down and using them as part of my art, and then I did, and then the success came with that. So it's almost like the universe is pointing you in the right direction. Have you ever read The Alchemist? The book The Alchemist?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I feel like my personal journey, like my personal treasure is this, and every now and then the universe will point you in the right direction and you'll be like, cool.
So what's The Alchemist about, quickly?
It's a fable, kind of like allegory of this boy who is off to find he has a dream about buried treasure, and then he realizes it's his personal destiny to find this treasure, and he ends up going into the desert and finding the pyramids and meeting this alchemist who teaches him all these life lessons. But the book is basically like a book of like life lessons, but it's all wrapped up in this story. If you haven't read it, I very much recommend going to read it. I listen to it almost every night.
You read it in French?
Yeah. But I think it's Portuguese.
It is Portuguese, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a translation.
Do we remember the name of the author?
It's Paulo Coelho. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have any advice for first getting published?
Yes, I do. I do have advice.
Give us all your information.
Advice that I wish
Share
I'd listened to.
Exclusive advice.
Exclusive advice. Okay, so if you're a writer and you first want to start getting published in magazines, because you'll start with magazines really, unless you're like big on the spoken word scene, in which case you'll probably do a show, and then you might do a book with a publisher who like knows who you are. But if you want to start publishing pieces in magazines, the first thing I would say is go through your work and edit. The second thing I would say is learn how to write a poetry cover letter and a bio, because when I first started writing, like sending stuff off to publishers, I had no idea what I was doing. And I look back at some of the pieces that I was sending and I was like, no wonder they didn't publish this. It just wasn't right for the magazine. It wasn't right for paid publication at all. And like the way I wrote the cover letter was really not how a poetry cover letter should be done.
What were some of the mistakes you were making in your covering letter?
So one thing I would say is always figure out who you're writing to. If you're sending stuff off to magazines, read the magazine. That's so important. Read the magazine. If you're looking to start getting published in magazines, subscribe to some magazines. So like even like the big one like Poetry Foundation, Poetry Wales is a really good one. Tangerine in Belfast, that's a really nice magazine to subscribe to. Under the Radar magazine, which is part of Nine Arches Press. Subscribe to, or like Poetry London as well. That's run from Goldsmiths, I think. That's a really good magazine. It's got really high caliber poets in it. Just start subscribing to some magazines, or even just reading them, or going to the poetry library and reading them when you get the chance, because they've got a load of magazines there that you can read. You'll start to get a sense of the kind of things that they publish. And then your work will just get better with reading. Like one of the biggest tips I can say is read more poetry. If you want to start publishing poetry, read more poetry, listen to more poetry, do whatever you want, but just get more poetry into your bloodstream. And then you'll start to understand which magazines want which kind of stuff. Always get the editor's name. Address your cover letter to the editor. If you can read one of their poems, so you know what kind of style they are, do that. And then write a short bio, like 50 words, and include it in your cover letter. And just acknowledge the editor and the magazine for reading it. Don't go into too much detail. Listen to what kind of work they want. Send that kind of work, and make sure that your poem reads well on the page, not just to be spoken. And then the other thing I would say is just keep submitting. You'll get rejected a lot at first. Like a lot. But every now and then you'll get an acceptance, and then the more acceptances you get, the more you kind of understand how the world works, and it will start rolling through. And you'll start like just kind of figuring it out. It is a bit of a trial and error process, but just do your research is the biggest thing that I can say. And
have you experienced a lot of rejection letters and things like that?
Like loads. You should see my submittable. It's like rejected. I've also got one with the New York Times at the moment, I think, which is like in progress.
Yeah.
And it's been there for like a year.
They're
like notorious though.
But the point was that you kept going at it. You kept persevering.
Just keep going.
You didn't.
Rejection letters don't actually hurt that much anymore at all. Like,
it's just part of the process.
It's just part of the process. You're like, okay, they didn't want it. Like, fine, someone else might want it. Or maybe it's a chance to take a look and see if you need to make some edits on it. And I've definitely done that with poems in the past. I've looked at poems that I've submitted somewhere, because they might come back to you like 6 months later, and then you're like, oh, let me have a look at that poem, and you're like, oh, of course they didn't want it. It's like riddled with grammar mistakes.
Not like grammar.
Yeah, well, not even that, but like with poetry, you have to be really specific with your grammar. Like in poems for Pete Davidson, for example, there's no full stops throughout the entire collection, and that's on purpose. There's a full stop on the last poem because it's kind of like a chain of thought. So the last poem is meant to be, the full stop is meant to symbolise it's done, finalised, over. So I did that on purpose, but you know, sometimes you'll put like a full stop and then you won't put a full stop anywhere else in the poem, and unless that's intentional, it doesn't read that well. So you'll start to understand how to grammatise your own poetry and stuff.
So the Pete Davidson collection is conclusive at the end of it. There's not going to be a sequel.
Well, we'll see. Maybe Pete Davidson and I will get married and then I'll have to write a sequel, an abridged version.
It's coming out 31st of August.
31st of August, yeah.
Where can we buy it?
You can buy it on brokensleep.com. Probably the best. Broken Sleep Books, I think it is. brokensleepbooks.com. Also, if you follow me on Instagram at Ella Sadie OG, I will be posting about it like all the time. So I'm sure you'll be able to cop a copy from me.
All right. It was
Cool.
so good to have you.
I think we covered everything. I feel like I've been talking like non-stop.
You can follow Ella on Instagram.
Yeah.
Ella Sadie OG, and you can follow our Instagram, Poetry to Your Ears.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Sans manteau ni parapluie, seulement son sac à dos pour les imprévus. Il est trempé. Je regarde l'autre côté de la rue. Mon regard est accroché par deux femmes qui discutent sous la pluie. Et je dois être excité. Oui, mais il faut le dissimuler. Je dois attendre qu'elles se séparent.